waiting for the red light. Welcome, everyone. My name is Michael Sinatra. I'm the director of the Research Center on Digital Humanities based at the Université de Montréal. Et c'est mon grand plaisir aujourd'hui d'accueillir Dino Felluga as one of our speakers in this year's series with the Département de littérature de langue du monde sort of contribution to this event. Dino is professor of English and critical theory at Purdue University in Indiana. He has published The Perversity of Poetry, Critical Theory, the Key Concept, as well as a 4-volume, million-word encyclopedia of Victorian literature. He is the creator of Britain Representation and 19th Century History, or Branch, and the Central Online Victorian Educator, or CoreCoab, that you can see behind me, about which he'll talk about today. Please join me in welcoming Dino Felluga.
Thank you. Get out of the way of the screen. Particularly excited to come back here because this is sort of where things got started for me with Michael in digital humanities. We started, or at least I helped Michael start, to put it more properly, Romanticism on the Net in the early days, back when we were both finishing our PhDs and postdocs before he came to the Université de Montréal. So this in many ways is the start of our adventure down the digital humanities. And I'll talk a little bit about how that has changed over the last couple decades, how the internet itself has also changed over that time. The title is, Can Victorian Studies Reclaim the Means of Production? As you see up there. How does a collectively shared not-for-profit platform like the Cove at covecollective.org change the way that we produce knowledge for dissemination to others? My argument here is that the Cove instantiates a different approach to knowledge production, one that has the potential to escape some of the pitfalls of our current reliance on the internet for knowledge dissemination. That reliance has been shaped in ways that we could not easily have anticipated when the internet entered the public imaginary and our everyday practices around 1996. I'm going to lay out in the first part of this talk the ways that the original promise of the internet has been increasingly turned against the goals of scholarly investigation before illustrating how the Cove reimagines our approach to knowledge production by reclaiming the means of production for collective reuse. I believe that we must come together to provide scholar-driven, not-for-profit alternatives to the commercial providers, which increasingly have a stranglehold on our university libraries, and that it's in our best interest to support platforms that allow our scholarship to be accessible to a worldwide audience in open access formats, thus countering our past tendency to keep our scholarship hidden behind the paywalls of the so-called deep web. However, we must be creative in thinking about how best to sustain such alternatives in the long term, while preserving those values of humanities scholarship that are increasingly threatened by various structural realities in the present day. So there are 4 parts. The first part where I talk about sort of the internet up to the semantic web. A second section where I talk about a very quick section about the state of the humanities today and other structural changes that have changed how we do scholarship today. Third section where I'll talk about Cove, and then a very short conclusion. So I'll start with part 1 called Caught in the Web, about 6 different aspects of the internet as they've developed over the last 20 years. So 6 of them. Web 1.0. For the first decade of the internet, online scholarship was delimited by an approach to knowledge production that had been shaped to a large extent by a previous technology, the codex book. Our first successful online journals, including Romanticism on the Net, sought to mimic print journals as precisely as possible, the same topics, essay lengths, and methodologies, for example. The great 19th century archives of the first wave of online scholarship, the Resetti, Blake, and Whitman archives, or Romantic circles, were radical expansions in scope, introducing images, audio, and film, for example. However, they each reproduced the skeuomorphic logic of codex publication. Individual texts, or more commonly texts and images, were authored as bound and fixed units, web pages, that were then published by lead editors in an online archive, usually with multiple hyperlinks to other bound and fixed units. The nature of static HTML is such that once published, these pages are largely frozen in place, much as in a codex book. The online project that preceded and feeds into the Cove, Branch, Britain representation in 19th century history at branchcollective.org is no different. 2, hyperlinks. The main difference from print books beyond multimedia is the hyperlinked nature of hypertext. And some of the editors of the first 19th century archives have made influential arguments about the transformative effects of hypertext, since hyperlinks give users a greater freedom of movement. The hyperlink allows users to move quickly from bound unit to bound unit, following either the links within a web page or, as became increasingly indispensable once these archives and the World Wide Web more generally grew, by way of search engines and the algorithms that drive them. Now, the branch homepage currently includes 2 search engines to help users find the information they need, along with a number of other aids: topic clusters, a simile timeline, a list of contributors. Readers may well choose their path. However, it's become increasingly clear as the web has grown that we're ever more reliant on not only such structured lists of links, but also on algorithms and metadata to help us find an ever-growing body of static objects, a fact that's made us susceptible to manipulation by advertisers, for example, but also by politically driven agents or foreign governments, as we're learning after the 2016 American election. Tout va bien?
Normalement, oui.
C'est quoi, le monde? Ça marche pas, c'est quoi? Hein? C'est marqué en direct?
Sorry, some technical difficulties.
It says here that we're live, but apparently not on YouTube.
Shall I continue?
Yes.
Okay. Although Google may well claim to follow the motto, "Don't be evil," Siva Vaidyanathan and others have made a compelling case for the dangers of relying so much on Google algorithms to find the information we seek on the internet. It's certainly true that Google's algorithms privilege certain values that do not match the values of scholarly investigation, especially widespread popularity over specialized intellectual rigor. After all, the driving engine for the company is advertising dollars, not accuracy, quality, or intellectual difficulty, except as these values are put in the service of maximum traffic. What would it take to regain control over the methods and processes that make sense of our information ecosystem, such that we privilege the values of scholarship instead: intellectual rigor, creative discovery, active debate, and the exploration of the arcane, the unpopular, the overlooked, and the marginalized? 3, Web 2.0. The most precise search tool at Branch is through a widget from Nines, Networked Infrastructure for 19th Century Electronic Scholarship at nines.org, a site that has evolved to facilitate the search for scholarly resources by leveraging the advantages of the semantic web through RDF, Resource Description Framework. Nines and the other sites it spawned, which are now managed by the superentity ARC, also peer reviews 19th century born digital scholarship as a service to the profession, but its main function now is to facilitate searches across databases, including those behind paywalls, like early English books online and 18th century collections online, EBO and ECHO. Now, unlike at the Cove, nothing but metadata is stored at Nines or ARC. The sites themselves exist elsewhere. Nines' value is in providing very precise searches that include metadata and text snippets from pre-vetted open access sites, as well as from sites that are otherwise behind paywalls, what has been termed the deep web. The semantic web, made possible by all of this metadata, is designed to help machines read well-structured data in properly encoded sites so that machines can then deliver the knowledge that is desired by users. Unfortunately, one disadvantage is that so much of what we do as humanities scholars is vague, uncertain, inconsistent, and overdetermined because our original objects of investigation, art, literature, history, are vague, uncertain, inconsistent, and overdetermined, which means that no data structure will ever be able fully to reflect the act of scholarly interpretation. It's the messiness of our objects of investigation and of our interpretive procedures that allows for the continual discovery of new meanings and works that we've been examining for hundreds of years. Now, the other effect of our turn to Web 2.0 coding standards is that website creation has become opaque to most scholarly users. a fact that has opened up an ever more palpable divide between digital humanists and what are often called traditional scholars. In the days of Web 1.0, it was possible to teach oneself code, as I did, in fact, since HTML follows human readable conventions. BR equals bridge return, for example. Now, the new conventions of the semantic web are exponentially more complicated, even as new tools and forms of information retrieval and recombination open up new worthwhile scholarly possibilities. Okay, 4. So I'm losing, I won't be able to do 5. Sustainability. Although the heady days of the web's first decade offered the promise of free and easily accessible scholarship, best exemplified for 19th century studies by the Blake Archive, the Resetti Archive, and Romantic circles, there's always been one rather major problem that has never been solved: sustainability. Perhaps the most important of these 5 advantages that the printing press has over born digital scholarship. And Branch, in many ways, was an effort to try to at least show that one can have dissemination, rigor, and even a certain degree of imprimatur, given the quality of the authors that he was able to attract. But sustainability and longevity continue to be 2 vexing problems. Although it's possible to receive large grants for new projects, there are often not mechanisms in place for long-term sustainability and continuing development of existing projects. Nines is a good example of the problem. Did I already have Nines?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah, Nines is a good example of the problem. Nines was extremely successful in establishing support from granting agencies, $2.8 million from the Mellon Foundation, awarded to Jerome McGann, plus 2 years of funding for the National Endowment for the Humanities, NEH, for 2 summer institutes on the evaluation of digital scholarship, awarded to Andrew Stauffer, as well as matching cost sharing from its home institution, the University of Virginia, $300,000 per year over 5 years, including a tenure line devoted to Nines held by Andrew Stauffer. It's quite an impressive amount of money for a humanities project. Now, the problem is that although grants can be secured to start DH projects, one rarely receives grants for continued support of already existing projects. Once the Mellon money was used up a decade later, there was virtually nothing left to sustain the project. A change in administration at the University of Virginia, a new dean, a new president, meant that there were also no institutional funds available after the initial 5-year investment. After $4 million, Nines now has almost no funds to support its work. Now, in our current environment, where the decks are increasingly stacked against humanities scholarship, we simply cannot count on our universities to sustain even the most well-established and highly regarded sites. The University of Maryland's decision this year to stop funding Romantic circles is another perfect example of the problem. There's an additional issue here. Almost all of the early great scholarly archives are tied to 1 or 2 leaders whose energy and vision largely ensure the persistence of the resources. To put it bluntly, what happens when those individuals pass away? 5, that was my problem. There's a 5th one. The deep web. Given these sustainability difficulties, we can be forgiven for relying instead on commercial providers to digitize our cultural heritage. They have the cash resources and infrastructure to mount the databases, and we can be sure that the resources will persist because of the massive amount of profit involved. Unfortunately, our willingness to rely on such databases has created a rather serious problem, compromising the university libraries that were originally established to support academic scholarship. An ever larger portion of library budgets now go towards database access rather than manuscript purchases, leading to a number of high-profile institutions encouraging scholars to publish only in open access venues. Responding to a memo from Harvard's Faculty Advisory Council stating that major publishers had created an untenable situation at the university by making scholarly interaction fiscally unsustainable and academically restrictive while drawing profits of 35% or more, Robert Darnton, then director of Harvard Library, responded to the university's subsequent decision to cease many of its subscriptions, this in an April 2012 article in The Guardian. I hope that other universities will take similar action. We all face the same paradox. We faculty do all the research, write the papers, referee papers by other researchers, serve on editorial boards, all of it for free. And then we buy back the results of our labor at outrageous prices. The system is absurd, and it is inflicting terrible damage on libraries. 1 year subscription to the Journal of Comparative Neurology costs the same as 300 monographs. We simply cannot go on paying the increase in subscription prices. In the long run, the answer will be open access journal publishing, but we need concerted effort to reach that goal, end quote. Now, a big concern has been science journals and the extortionist prices charged by large commercial providers like Elsevier, Springer, and Wiley. However, a similar situation applies to humanities databases. Best example is Gail Sengage's ECHO, 18th Century Collections Online, which consists, as the Gale site states, of every significant English language and foreign language title printed in the United Kingdom during the 18th century. And if you're a scholar of 18th century Britain, it's much harder for you to compete with your peers if your own institution does not have access to such a rich database to support your research. Yet many institutions, particularly in the United States, simply cannot afford the subscription cost. To give you a sense of the magnitude of the problem, I'll just provide the figures for Purdue. Purdue alone paid over $300,000 for the ECHO dataset, and in addition to that, pays $6,000 per year for the platform that serves up the information through its library catalog portal. That's just one university, just one database. And because of the problem I'm describing here, Elaine Friedgood and I initiated an effort eventually supported by the Andrew Mellon Foundation to create a virtual university made up of scholarly societies to help American scholars gain access to such databases, since right now the only way to do so is to get a job at an institution that does subscribe. Now, Mellon paid for the original meeting of all the major North American literature and history field societies, which occurred February 2010 in the Mellon office in New York. The meeting led to a feasibility study helmed by the American Council of Learned Societies, followed by a negotiation with the commercial providers, especially ProQuest and Gail Sengage. Now, the effort ultimately failed. As I write in an article in the Open Access Journal 19 about this effort, the unwillingness of these commercial providers to find a mechanism for giving scholars access to their databases for the reason that it was not worth their effort for so little monetary return, as well as the fear that such access would threaten their library subscription model, is a sign that we must find an alternative way forward to safeguard our cultural heritage and ensure untrammeled scholarly investigation of past cultural objects. Now, a big part of the problem is that we currently have few viable alternatives that can allow our cultural heritage to remain open access and not for profit while ensuring long-term sustainability and longevity. As my last section of this part, crowdsourcing. Of course, there are a few massively popular and therefore surely sustainable open access mechanisms for sharing knowledge on the internet, perhaps best exemplified by Wikipedia and Genius. Both make use of crowdsourcing and to share information and include mechanisms for helping to ensure the content is somewhat trustworthy. However useful they may be, such sites are quite different from academic scholarship. Wikipedia, for example, offers us a form of knowledge that tends towards common denominators, since the format cannot easily accommodate complexity and contradiction. The rhetoric of authoritative knowledge, since individual entries do not actively seek to make an argument so much as synopsize extant knowledge about a subject, which is the genre of the encyclopedia entry, and unacknowledged biases, since the site's tendency is to reflect the status quo when it comes to thinking about a particular subject, a fact certainly not diminished by the fact that the large majority of contributors are male, which Wikipedia acknowledges actually in an entry on the subject. Genius is another free open access crowdsourcing platform offering users a wide assortment of documents that have been edited with annotations, including quite a large selection of literature. However, since contributors tend not to be academics, the annotations are largely untrustworthy. No peer review, no copy editing, few scholarly standards for rigor, though the information is presented as if it were authoritative. Is part 2, current state of the humanities. Now, while the internet has been reshaping knowledge production for the digital age, we've seen a number of threats to traditional knowledge production, especially in the humanities. There's no denying the fact that the old system supporting the humanities is broken. The old system, which functioned well enough for about 100 years, was a closed loop. Universities funded both university presses and university libraries, allowing presses to publish the best books written by university scholars, regardless of how arcane the subject matter, since presses could rely on a certain number of libraries to purchase hard copies of those same books. Now, as soon as university presses and university libraries lost their previous support and were asked to break even on their own, we entered a situation where subtle considerations about demand have affected what scholars can publish, with some subject areas, novel studies, for example, and some formats, shorter books, for example, increasingly preferred over others. Now, the reality of the situation cannot be denied, though it's easy to continue to proceed as we've always done since the changes have been incremental. Scholarly books are still getting published, after all, over a decade after then-President Stephen Greenblatt's letter from the Modern Language Association warning everyone in North America about the crisis of humanities publishing. It's the gradualness and unevenness of the change that has been most pernicious. Indeed, a revealing, though admittedly surprising analog for the situation is global warming, another pressing reality that is easy to ignore. As Slavoj Žižek puts it, quote, "Our attitude here is that of the fetishistic split. I know very well that global warming is a threat to the entire humanity, but nonetheless, I cannot really believe it," end quote. Žižek explains that, quote, "The problem is not the uncertainty about facts, as those who caution us against panic claim, but our inability to believe that it can really happen. Look through the window, the green grass and blue sky are still there, life carries on, nature follows its rhythm," end quote. Now, as with global warming, it's too easy to dismiss the threats currently faced by the humanities. Neither the accumulation of facts nor common sense will serve. Every discipline in the humanities is in such crisis that all signs seem to point to the inevitable destruction of the traditional humanities. However, as with global warming, we face an inability to believe that it can really happen. Greenblatt named the crisis back in 2002, yet books are still being published. We still have liberal arts departments. We still have students in our classes, if, especially in the United States, ever fewer of them. The green grass and blue sky are still there. Life carries on. If we can for a moment entertain the conviction that we are endangered, how might we, as Žižek proposes, quote, "retroactively undo what is already written in the stars as our destiny," end quote. Now, as with global warming, the statistical facts are clear and hard to deny when we discuss the crisis facing humanities publishing. Over the last 25 years, we've seen a dramatic reduction in university allocations to both presses and libraries, though again, the change has been experientially gradual. As American Research Libraries reported in 2002, the percentage of university the percentage of university funds spent on libraries has declined over the past 25 years from a high of 3.7% in 1984 to just under 2% in 2009, a trend that applies to both public and private universities in both the United States and Canada. One can see an even clearer trend if one considers all public libraries in the United States. Just as in the US, libraries in the UK have been spending less on books since at least the early 1990s. In a 2002 report, the Audit Commission, a government agency charged with assuring proper stewardship of public finances, found that spending on books had dropped by a third, from 15% to 10% of total library budgets between 1992 and 2002, even while overall library funding remained largely stable and consumer book purchases increased by over 25% over the same period. Now, as already mentioned, those smaller percentage allocations have increasingly gone not to manuscript purchases, but to electronic databases, with an ever larger portion of library budgets going to commercial providers. Scholars increasingly find themselves in a difficult situation. Libraries have reduced the number of manuscripts and journals they produce and that they purchase, which has meant that presses are no longer able to publish everything that is of value to scholars of the period. Presses have responded to the situation by publishing a tsunami of handbooks, encyclopedias, and companions over the last decade because they know that libraries will still purchase books directed to undergraduate classrooms. And what's needed is a viable, open access, not-for-profit alternative that allows scholars to publish any material they deem valuable for an understanding of their field of study, not just material that will be used in the classroom, with all material put through peer review, followed by revision, copy editing, and proofing. And we need to accomplish this feat in a way that ensures the sustainability and longevity of the platform. To all of this, of course, is leading to CoreCoab. So one possible way forward. The CoreCoab is one scholar-driven effort to provide such an alternative, one that seeks also to counter some of the nefarious tendencies of the internet I listed in the first part of the talk. Part of the problem is that we're not in control of the means of production, nor do we control either the cultural capital or the real capital that allows presses to stay in the black. purchasing the products of our labor for next to nothing, and then selling them back to us in expensive products marketed to libraries and the undergraduates that libraries increasingly see themselves as serving. And one example among many, Wiley Blackwell expects to earn up to $500,000 over the life of the Encyclopedia of Victorian Literature, a collection I edited with Pamela Gilbert and Linda Hughes, largely by selling the print collection and its online version to university libraries across the world, with libraries in Asia a particularly lucrative market. Each 4-volume, million-word set costs $800, significantly more if one wishes to purchase online access for an institution. As an example, Purdue alone purchased online access for 6 titles from the Wiley Blackwell Encyclopedia series for $8,533. The close to 300 authors of the encyclopedia's entries will see none of that $500,000, nor will the over 500 scholars who served as peer reviewers of the encyclopedia's individual articles. The scholars who created the encyclopedia also have no control over what happens to the content. Indeed, now that the collection is published, it's hard even to get email responses from Wiley Blackwell. We do not matter to these presses, as is evidenced by the unwillingness of commercial presses to work with us to provide scholars access to their databases, even as these presses rely on the products of our intellectual labor to help them turn a profit. What if we could provide an alternative that reclaims the means of production and that offers a mechanism for the generation of not-for-profit funds that we can then use to support the long-term sustainability of the enterprise? And digital humanities have occasionally been offered as a solution to the woes of the humanities. At other times, digital humanities have been denigrated as contributing to the neoliberal takeover of the university. The biggest reason for the latter characterization, I think, is the divide that has formed between digital and traditional humanists, caused by the not inconsiderable fact that programming in the age of Web 2.0 and the semantic web is beyond the ability of not only traditional scholars, but even most digital humanists, who largely rely on programmers charging as much as $150 an hour for their coding work. 2 recent articles in particular caused quite a stir, one by Allington, Bruyette, and Galumbia in the LA Review of Books, one by Timothy Brennan in the Chronicle of Higher Education. Both articles attack and even to some extent equate digital humanities with data mining, what Franco Moretti has influentially dubbed distant learning. Now, in contrast to these rather nefarious portrayals of digital humanities, my intention with Branch and Cove is to draw traditional humanists into a collective digital humanities project that can help us better to understand the period while using existing open source tools to keep down the costs of the project, which I hasten to add are still considerable. Now, the main goal of the platform is to facilitate the reading of and writing about the Victorian corpus, especially through group annotation, with research questions also oriented towards history and geospatial thinking. We're providing a platform, one that allows any number of research questions to be explored in relation to any number of scholarly objects of investigation. In the introduction to the Cove Omnibus edition of EBB's Elizabeth Barrett Browning's On a Portrait of Wordsworth that I edited with Marjorie Stone and others, I contrast our approach to that of distant reading and call it instead persistent reading. I should mention my other editors, Joshua King and Christopher Rovey. Although just as much aided by the use of digital tools, our approach is one of continual performative and communal rereading, with each interpretation opening for us new channels and observations. The platform thus facilitates the messiness of debate and discovery. We also offer an invitation to others to continue this process through future annotations of any given text, since additions can later be made part of a class and new annotations added. Unlike a traditional codex edition, traditionally a senior scholar offering a unified vision and interpretation of an author's oeuvre, our editions are an ever-regenerating performance that is communal and persistent through time. Instead of exacerbating the divide between traditional and digital humanists, we wish to put these tools into everyone's hands so that we can begin editing and disseminating what we determine to be valuable in understanding the period, then to publish, after peer review, copy editing, and proofing, anything that a scholar or group of scholars would like to see made openly accessible to everyone else via Cove editions. And what I'm proposing is a rethinking of how we approach our research work and scholarly publications in a way that gets us around some of the problems I outlined in the first part of my talk. including the following goals. Deracinate the web. The Cove seeks to free online content from static sites like Branch. Once Branch timeline content was deracinated from branchcollected.org and ingested into the Cove database, it became available for collective reuse. One can quickly build a timeline by drawing on elements in the Branch timeline, that's a Branch timeline element, if one wishes, and then continue building with new content from there. Same goes for the map builder, which draws on now over 600 vetted places from across the globe. As you see, it's embedded within the timeline itself. As new timelines and maps get published at Cove, the elements from those timelines and maps will be made available to future users, allowing content to accrete quite quickly, but in a way that is shared by all users. As you see there, we have a 1880s ordnance survey behind a Google Map API so that you can also see what any given place looked like, at least in the United Kingdom, looked like in the 1880s. And you can easily toggle between, so you can see what it looked like in the 1880s versus what it looks like now. Jerome McGann and I have done something similar with some of the content from the Resetti Archive for a gallery of images connected to Christina Resetti's in an artist studio, which you see here. Future users will be able to use these images and descriptions when they create their own galleries. And one of the neat things is that we've linked up each of the tools. So they're all different tools, but they're interconnected. So within here, you can see the place where that photograph was taken. There's a mini timeline that draws from timeline elements that are linked to this particular image. What I think is significant for textual editing is that the nature of what is created is different. Static HTML and early online journals try to mimic the codex book. The Cove seeks to explode the codex in favor of endless reassembly and reannotation. 2, make knowledge collective. The result is an ever-growing database of knowledge that facilitates the assembly of custom pages. One can choose to collect only peer-reviewed, copy-edited elements, or one can draw from other content, depending on your particular needs. And this way, one can build knowledge in a way that is shared with others rather than hidden behind a paywall, allowing you to build custom maps and timelines in literally minutes, as illustrated in our first how-to video on the site. 3, make knowledge rigorous. While we facilitate the collective creation of timelines, maps, galleries, and annotated editions, we also aim to ensure the quality and uniformity of products submitted for publication. Our goal is to offer peer review, revision, and copy editing that matches or exceeds the standards of university and commercial presses. 4, combine products rather than isolate elements. The site allows you easily to associate different kinds of content. Timeline, map, gallery elements can all be interconnected, even though they're being created by completely different tools, as I illustrated as the video, the screen capture illustrated earlier. Also, each of those individual timeline elements and each of those individual places has its own URL, so you can very easily interlink with any one piece of knowledge, say in an annotation to a poem or a novel. 5, share tools. We're sharing not only knowledge, but also tools. Our goal is to make tools available in an interface that's so easy to use that non-DH scholars can quickly adopt them. The map, timeline, and gallery builders, for example, use the same interface so that once you learn one, you can very quickly start using the others without having to learn any code. 6, bridge the teaching research divide. We wish also to bridge the current divide between teaching and research, whereas university presses and libraries are increasingly seeing themselves as catering to the needs of undergraduate students, since there is money to be made there. We at Cove feel that undergraduate education should rather be shaped to follow the research of scholars. This is what the class interface looks like at Cove. As you can see, you can very easily keep track of students. You can put up a syllabus here. If you scroll down that page, you can build your things here. This is a timeline. You might, if you build a map, it'll appear here. A gallery would appear here. You can keep track of what students are doing, so you can see if they've been doing the correct amount of material. It's a graph that's created on the fly. And so this is the timeline that I created with my students in a class on Leonardo da Vinci, for example. Each student was asked to do, I think I said 9 timeline entries. And so with this class of 20 students, you have a very massive timeline very quickly, and everybody's working on it together so they can see it accrete very quickly over time, which is kind of exciting for them. The teaching essays that can be found at the Cove illustrate the many ways that early adopters have used Cove to engage students in scholarly work, in public exhibits, in research projects, and in edition building. And 7, another goal, ensure sustainability. Our goal is to keep the Cove open access, open source, open copyright, and not for profit. Of course, that's a tall order given the not insignificant costs of running such a complex initiative, not to mention the costs of copy editing, bug fixes, UI, UX upgrades, and user support. Our proposed solution is to charge only for the use of our tools, not the content created with the tools. There may be a charge, $10 per year per student, very nominal. But by adopting the tools for the classroom, one can actually save on the cost of textbooks, since you can upload any text for a course through Course Studio. And you can then additionally annotate them with your students or allow them to do it themselves. You can build timelines, maps, and galleries with your students, or they can build any of the above as individual projects on their own. We have also established a consortium of schools that have contributed a modest amount to pay for the work of our research assistants, including so far Purdue, Rutgers, Texas Christian University, University of Delaware, Ryerson, the University of Alberta, Carleton, the University of Exeter, the University of Birmingham, Birkbeck, the University of Delaware, and Queen Mary. And the Université de Montréal is welcome to join us as well. See, this whole thing has been a long pitch for you. Universities provide funds that remain at the institutions to pay for the labor of their own graduate students who join an initiative they believe in while gaining skills they can later use in their own careers. The Cove provides training and manages workflow, trying whenever possible to match tasks with the interests of the individual postgrads, that is to say graduate students in North American parlance. This is part of an earlier talk. And finally, my last goal, provide long-term institutional support. The Cove has been created without the help of a university or commercial press and is not hosted by any one university. Instead, it's overseen by the 3 largest Victorian studies organizations in the world: the North American Victorian Studies Association, which you see here, the British Association for Victorian Studies, and the Australasian Victorian Studies Association. We're thus exploring an alternative form of institutional support and encouraging scholarly societies to enter the business of pedagogy and publication. Indeed, our long-term goal is to help other scholarly societies follow NAVSA's example. Right now, or before, these various things existed separately from each other. The goal here is to try to restructure it so that branch is feeding into Cove. Cove is overseen by NAVSA, and then tools and metadata are shared with others. Because of such supervision by scholarly societies, we can ensure that there's a mechanism in place to find replacements for the editors of the site, and thus ensure the continuation of the initiative well into the future. And there's a utopic imagining of how this could potentially work with different scholarly. I mean, the long-term goal is to build on what we've been doing at Cove and to open it up to other field societies under a super entity that we've dubbed SHORE, supporting human online research and education. Human rather than humanities, because we think the tools can be used beyond just the humanities. As you can see, I like acronyms. So these are all made up acronyms. I particularly like MOAT, actually, Medieval Open Access Technology. I hope somebody uses that. So here's my conclusion. So I'll finish by returning to my global warming analogy. In his book, In Defense of Lost Causes, Zizek proposes what he argues is a more effective response to global warming. He turns in the following passage to Jean-Pierre Dupuy. This, then, is how Dupuy proposes to confront the forthcoming catastrophe. We should first perceive it as our fate, as unavoidable, and then projecting ourselves into it, adopting its standpoint, we should retroactively insert into its past, the past of the future, counterfactual possibilities. If we had done this and that, the catastrophe that we are in now would not have occurred, upon which we then act today. Therein resides Dupuy's paradoxical formula. we have to accept that at the level of possibilities, our future is doomed, that the catastrophe will take place. It is our destiny. And then, against the background of this acceptance, we should mobilize ourselves to perform the act which will change destiny itself and thereby insert a new possibility into the past, end quote. I propose that we adopt the same strategy in addressing not the fate of humanity, but rather the fate of the humanities. If you think that these two considerations are incommensurable, because we are talking about dramatically different orders of scale, I remind you that at least on the political stage, both Donald Trump's US government now and Barack Obama's government in the previous 8 years align economic theory and science in a bipartisan dismissal of the humanities. Apparently, this is the one thing on which Republicans and Democrats can agree. Now, of course, one can see the same trends in Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom. In the United States, both Democrats and Republicans have argued that the STEM disciplines are not only the more useful career path for the next generation, but also on some level, a truer representation of reality. Now, to my mind, this is a strange claim, since economics and technology have brought us to the brink of global catastrophe through the promotion of models and mechanisms that now threaten global destruction because of war and the devastation of the environment. Thinking that the humanities do not deserve to be a part of these conversations, in other words, is precisely what has led to our current situation. By refusing to acknowledge the ethical limitations, global implications, and historical emergence of our presumptions, which the various disciplines of the humanities are in the best position to provide, we may well be dooming ourselves to the worst possible fate. For these reasons, I think it's fair to apply Dupuis' global warming strategy to the crisis of the humanities as well. What if we accepted that there is no going back, that the humanities are dead? Accepting this, we can begin to posit a completely different system of knowledge dissemination that retroactively opens up a radically new possibility for humanities scholarship, one that, in an act of time travel back from the moment of the humanities' apocalyptic destruction, breaks with the current order of knowledge production so that it is scholars rather than commercial providers or Google who determine the values of our work. We can thus also ensure that the perspective and methods of humanities scholars remain readily available to the public in a way that ensures that our values, investigation, debate, rigor, difficulty, are affirmed rather than perniciously undermined. Thank you.
Thank you, Dino. We have time for questions, comment. Marcelo.
Thank you very much. I liked very much your presentation, and I think I share all of your analysis. It was really interesting to listen to. I have some very precise questions about the platform. So just what I think it's a Drupal. I was looking, and so I would like to hear more about the infrastructure and how actually how you think about the infrastructure in order to assure sustainability in a long time period. So this would be a precise question, and another one more theoretical is: do you think that this end of humanities is more? Is it only an institutional problem? I mean, is it? Can we read it as an important crisis of institutions which were supposed to do humanities, and first of all, universities? It's just an open question. I don't know the answer, but I have the feeling that so humanities have not always been in universities, and it's a complicated history. I mean, in some period of history, universities have had an important role to play. In other periods, no. Just it seems like the humanities and critical thinking and theory went away from universities. So, do you think it's more the end of humanities as a whole, or a migration of some practices from some stabilized institutions that we know as universities to something else. I don't know what, but perhaps some web actors can play an important role in the production of knowledge, and perhaps we don't like it or them, but perhaps there are some of them that we could like. So right. You know, it's just and what interests me in your project is that it is not university based. It's more based on associations, if I understand well, and so. Perhaps there is something to think about the relationship between this association savant and universities, in order to find out if we can imagine some other institutional solution to keep humanities living, even in countries where the political framework will not allow for humanities to keep existing in the university. I mean, in Japan, they just shut down the humanities university. So it's just a reality. It's already a reality. It's not a kind of in the future we will not exist. We are starting to die right now.
Right.
So
yeah, I had a question. I gave this talk recently that has had me thinking afterwards. Someone asked, haven't we always been complaining about the death of the humanities all the way back to the Victorian period? I mean, every decade there's a different claim about the death of the humanities. And what I didn't say at the time, but that I realized is the right way to approach that, is that that is the case if you go back to the Victorian period, but that's within what is actually a very small blip in a longue durée history of the humanities, as you say, right? So it was in the Victorian period that our current system was established that allowed for both the new criticism on the one side and critical theory on the other, both of which are relying on this closed loop of funding libraries and presses that allowed us to have that conversation behind paywalls in libraries on our universities with very few readers, our own students and other professors. But again, it was just that 100-year period. As you say, you go back just a few more decades to, Coleridge having to go around selling subscriptions to the Friend to everybody he could convince to listen to him. You have a very different approach to how one goes about doing humanities scholarship in that culture of the man of letters. A little further back, and of course, you're into rich people basically funding what humanities do. So there have been many models, and so I agree with you that we're clearly at a watershed moment. Things are changing, and we need to think about a future way. Or I don't know if scholarly societies will step up to the plate. They have, I think, to this point in the Victorian period, and my hope is by showing that it can work in one, maybe I can convince other societies to join. It doesn't have to be a single field society. It could be, say, a subject area that could adopt the tool set in order to explore that particular area of study. And in that way, provide an alternative that hopefully is sustainable. Now, you asked me sustainability, but you didn't mean sustainability in terms of money, right? You meant sustainability in terms of digital infrastructure?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so also money, but most of all technical infrastructure.
Well, some of it is money. So money on some level is sustainability because it gives you the money to retool everything. Yeah. So and that's certainly what we're aiming for. And our long-term goal is to eventually go to library subscription, which is where a lot of money exists. And I think there are a lot of librarians that are very supportive of this kind of project because they recognize the problem that exists now in having to purchase their databases from commercial providers. Whether I can really convince librarians, I don't know. But I think it's important that it's scholars that are driving the project. That was one of the things that I found particularly exciting about joining the Nines project. And Jerome McGann was always very forthright about that being the goal. And it doesn't matter if we fail. What's important is that we are scholars who are trying to build the platform. And he speaks very eloquently about the power and the value of failure. So I think it's important to try to figure out mechanisms that can work for the next generation, because as you say, there's clear signs that we are dying all across various humanities departments across various countries. So some alternative is required. And I feel that there's a real need for it now because of larger problems that could benefit from having the perspective of humanities scholars, global warming being one among many. Yeah.
I was quite curious about the tools you use. So you mentioned Drupal, and I know that's.
Oh yes, that's right. So I was going to answer about sustainability so the goal, and we earlier had a conversation about minimal computing. So there have been a few articles about minimal computing as an alternative to a previous approach where you poured a lot of money into very complex tools that then nobody used. And so our goal here, by contrast, is to pick open source tools that already are vibrant, already have a strong support community, an open source community, but then put them together in a way that's then easy for non-DH people to learn. And that's one reason we do use the Drupal environment, because that's what allows for the same interface. Even though they're 3 different tools, Drupal provides the same basic interface so that you can use the map builder, use the gallery builder, use the timeline builder, and it all looks very familiar. So once you learn one, you can learn the others. Same thing with Annotator.js, which is what's behind the annotation tool. Again, it's got a vibrant community, but obviously it's going to take money to fully, they're still uncertain what the future will be for annotation software. And there are multiple competing platforms making use of the same basic code set in Annotator.js. So ideally, we would have money to continue to build on that open source platform. We do share everything. So as I say, it is open source. Everything's on GitHub. So anybody can build on what we're doing, just as we're building on what others have done in the past.
So the idea is to scale up, is to disseminate. I mean, if I have a society and I want to use it, I just install it on my own servers. Or do you think what would be your scale up model?
Yeah, I mean, you could do that right now, because as I say, the tools are there and available, but very few people actually have the wherewithal to do such a thing, right? Even you call it open source, but to actually go in and take the tools and build it take a lot of money. And so the goal here is to I'm learning from what happened with Nines. So Nines had a number of sister sites that were built on that same Colex software, 18th Connect, Mesa, which is the medieval group, or Modnet's a modernist group, and all the sites look kind of similar. And the way it works is that each one took the basic tool, this Colex search and exhibition tool, and mounted an instance of it. But it's all under one umbrella at Arc. And as a result, you can now search metadata across all of the various sites, and not just field sites, but other projects have been interested in adopting the tool set. Like there's one Great Lakes project that's about the history of the Great Lakes. There's nothing to do with specific fields of literature, but they use the tool set, and you can now search across that database as well. So if everybody wants to come under the same umbrella, I mean, you could take the tools, as I say, and build something on your own. But if you wanted to come under that umbrella of what we're calling Shore, that would gain the advantage of being able then to share these little, these database bits and elements across fields and across subject areas, so that you can, again, build things very quickly by standing on the shoulders of those that have come before.
And so, excuse me, just on the same topic, Shore, does it offer support to install an instance of the platform?
That will be the idea. It doesn't exist. This is an idea.
This is the idea.
That's
and
the
so
idea.
You will be able to provide support for installing and customizing a platform, which will be so self-standing, separated from the other, and then to index all the metadata and to have this umbrella. But the different instances of the platforms could be in different servers and based in different places.
Conceivably, it could be on a separate server, although probably it'd be easiest to just maintain everything on the same basic Ruby on Rails infrastructure. And we're working with provider who's the main company behind Nines and Cove and Branch, named Performant, and it's made its niche, and also Arc. It's made its niche helping and thinking through these problems with humanities scholars. And it's what's nice, we've set up a relationship whereby were this to happen and we set this up, and they're able to scale up to these kinds of numbers. The more than half of the profit always goes back to the shore. So we have a way to ramp up, but in such a way that the majority of any money comes back for the not-for-profit venture.
Well, it's just because I think I heard you. I work a lot with visualization, especially maps. So I was quite interested in your timeline in the map, and you said it was already integrated in Drupal, right?
Yeah.
But the map, I think I heard you say Google Maps is that because there's a lot of humanities research that was done using the Google Maps API, and it is a very tricky thing to do because it seems easier and simpler at first, but then amazing projects such as Hyper Cities from David Pesner has gone completely dark. It's not there anymore just because the API changed so much. It didn't have the sustainability, they didn't have the money to get someone to recode the API, and the entire project is gone. And it's just how sustainable is it to be ever linked to Google Maps?
And the Google Map API just recently, in the last month,
they just keep changing it.
Well, not only changed it, but now charges you if you have a certain level of usage, which wasn't the case before. So, and I've spoken in the talk about some of the dangers of getting in bed with Google. So, that's something that could be changed. In fact, we had a different map API before, but Google gave us certain functionalities that we wanted to make use of. We could change that again. As long as the geolocation, the geolocation for the ordnance map could be linked up with any one that follows the same, any other map that follows the proper, latitude and longitude numbers. But for now, we are using Google Map API. But we're open to thinking through. And for example, the annotation software has gone through multiple iterations. So we started by using a version of Annotator.js that was based on Lacuna, which was at Stanford. Amanda Visconti, who created Infinite Ulysses, was at Purdue when we started the project, and that was the version of Annotator.js that she used. And we decided to switch to Annotation Studio, which was at MIT, which meant a complete rethinking of everything that we had done up until that point, because we wanted a better mechanism for managing lots of users and managing lots of different kinds of documents. And Annotation Studio provided that with us. So, we're open to changing our basic platform when it is valuable to the users of the platform. But of course, it takes money. It all takes time and money to do that.
The data that are created through annotation, is it going back to Arc, or is it?
The metadata is, yeah. So we generate metadata that then is shared with Arc, but Arc is just metadata. There's no content there. Yeah. So our goal is to actually provide the server space for the content. That's one of the things
What kind of metadata do you?
Well, it's very simple RDF. Very simple RDF generation that we do. Same thing with Branch. Branch has a very simple RDF that's behind it that, I didn't want to be doing a lot of hand RDF coding. And so it's the most stripped down basic RDF frame, but it's enough so that Nines can find individual articles and provide snapshot or thumbnails of the individual articles so that they look good and they're easy to find through the Arc interface. And we do the same with this.
What about the annotations?
Oh, the annotations themselves are not. They could be, and that's our long-term goal is to rework all of our coding to open annotation standards, which would presumably help us to make that possible. But again, that's hugely expensive and time-consuming, so we'll require a significant grant to do that. And we're working on getting that grant, but we haven't yet.
Another very little question about what's the status of Assure? It's a non-profit organization?
Will be, yeah. That's
Okay.
the idea.
It's not for now. You're going to create, so it's not university dependent.
Right, and CoreCoab is now not-for-profit. That's actually an advantage of working under NAFSA, which already has not-for-profit 501c3 status with the IRS, and so everything is working under CoreCoab. So that small amount that you pay to use the tools, $10 per year per student, that gets paid through NAFSA now. But we would create a similar not-for-profit mechanism for payments going forward.
And that will be enough from
That's what I don't know yet. Yeah, I mean, but I think it's important that we try, that we try to figure out mechanisms for making it work in such a way that we're in control of the profits, not the commercial giants.
Yeah,
and it doesn't mean that it's going to be easy. I mean, a good example here is, I think, Zotero, which was started by what's his name? I'm forgetting. He's a George Mason, and Zotero basically made EndNote unnecessary. And I remember EndNote was a pretty major software company, and they saw the threat in EndNote and started a lawsuit against that. And thankfully, Georgetown backed its a pretty young scholar actually who created that, and won the case. And obviously, we don't hear about EndNote anymore. So EndNote died as a result of that battle.
University of Montreal still subscribes to it.
Oh, really?
It's listed on our list of prepaid software.
But that is a case where a university professor provided a free free not-for-profit alternative that won against the behemoth. So it can be done.
About global warming, Dupuy seems to say that we need to build on the
ruins.
Yeah. And you transpose this to the humanities. Do you think we have rules already for humanities?
Don't we?
And if we have, do you think the web is yet in ruins so that we can build up, or do we need to wait a little bit more that the web crashes? And what will be the ruins of the web?
Well, again, I think the real danger is to wait. You wait, and others will fill in the. I mean, that's how the commercial providers have gained so much power, is that we've allowed them to. So we haven't provided any alternatives. And so people can be forgiven for turning to those instead, or for turning to Genius, because again, they don't have access to our scholarly editions. We hide them away, right, in libraries and behind paywalls. So as far as the general public is concerned, they don't understand what it is to do humanities scholarship, what it is to do a close analysis of a poem, for example. There are lots of poems. There are 5 different versions of Lady of Shalott over at Genius. They're all ridiculous, from the standpoint of someone who has spent a lifetime learning what it is to, poetry, the tradition of different generic forms and different kinds of analysis. It's the point of going through the educational system that we go through. You go to Genius, but as far as the general public is concerned, they don't know that that's what we do.
What I mean is that we are building on the same, not only technical, but let's say we're on the same technology than the commercials institution. So if our academic institution are already in ruins, we're still using the same, and we are running behind Google and the others. So, and that's where I was wondering.
What would be the alternative to using, you're saying an alternative to using the World Wide Web? What would that be?
Yeah, I was wondering.
I don't know. I think we have to use the tools at our disposal now. I mean, in some ways, that's also how we're approaching the minimal computing use of open source tools. It's a kind of bricolage. These are the things that seem to be the most viable now. It may change 10 years down the road, but these are the ones that are viable now that are particularly useful. And we choose these ones because they seem to speak to important things that can be of use both to our scholarship and to our teaching, history timelines, geospatial thinking, images and the annotation, critical commentary upon images, and annotation to any given text. That covers a good amount of material. It's not all there is. There's more to do, but the goal, it would be to make that at least viable so that then you can add additional tools. It would be nice to be able to add Juxta, for example, to be able to add Omeka S to the tool set. Like once you have a start and you begin to have a money flow, you can begin to add other tools to the material. I don't have any alternative to the World Wide Web. We are using that. It's a very useful tool. Yeah.
I was just wondering, how long has CoreCoab been online, and what have you seen about its use, whether it's institutional, like for teaching purposes, versus just like general public? Do people actually go on it? How?
Well, that's the advantage of having worked with Michael in creating Romanticism on the Net in 1996. So you can imagine just how hard it was to get anybody to contribute an article in 1996 to an online journal, right? And yet, in just 10 years of the journal, by 2006, 2007, we started having assistant professors from Stanford and Michigan submitting their articles. And I mentioned those schools because you don't automatically get tenure at those schools. So it really matters where you place your articles. So given how slowly academia changes, we saw that change happen pretty quickly over those 10 years. The CoreCoab is new. So it's only been around, I've only had it open to users for a year and a half. And it's going to be a long game because it's a question of convincing people that they should change the way they teach by adopting a new thing, right? Having said that, we're starting to see usage. So, we have, I don't know, this semester we had about 10 classes from around the world, really, because we've had classes in Canada and the UK and the United States making use of the tools. And we're not actually in a hurry to ramp up, because obviously new users will find faults with the individual tools that give us a little bit of time to fix them before people rush to the use of the tools. So the goal is to build slowly but surely. If we do it right, then once even a single class makes use of the tools and likes it, they'll make use of the tool every time, right? And each time will be a new set of students paying $10 per year for access to the tool. So if we do it properly, we ramp up in a way that keeps all users happy, I think it can succeed. I can say that my own experience, I used it for a course on Leonardo da Vinci, in part to show that the tool set works just fine for all fields and subject areas, not limited to the Victorian period. There's just some content that can be drawn on for the Victorian period. The students, I didn't have to teach them at all. And that's our goal. Our goal is to have students be able to get in, log in, and just learn it on their own. It has to be that simple. And the same thing with the editions that are listed. If you go over to editions and you look at the people who are annotating, those aren't digital humanists. In fact, I want the most traditional scholars to be involved in that annotation. And if they can do it, presumably anybody can do it.
I have a question about if we still have time, about if you have or if you plan to have any policies for multilingualism, especially because I think that one important issue of this death of humanities is actually the English as the main language, and as you know, in humanities is actually a question of language more than other disciplines. So, and a problem with the web is actually that it has become more and more Anglophone based and centered, and that the GAFAM, and so the main corporation running it are Anglophone, which is a problem for our disciplines, which are very focused on different languages. So I think it could be really interesting to have partnerships with scholars speaking other languages,
Absolutely.
so French but also language which are minority languages. I don't know if you plan something.
I would love that. And there's nothing delimiting the tool set to English. Anybody can annotate in any language. There is a limitation in that we provide some content, and the content is all in English right now. But the nature of the database, if one created an instance of the tool set in Italy, say, and you started to have Italian content uploaded, it would be accessible if that entity decided to share what it does with other entities on the same database, then you'd have access to that material. You'd suddenly have Italian language content, for example, or any other language content.
I think there is a really important institutional issue what you are doing. I mean, the political, let's call it, part is as important as the infrastructure. If you are able to raise a community, an international community, and to develop practices here and there, I think it could be a very interesting thing. And another thing linked to languages too is the relationship. I think this is just a suggestion. So Research Isidore and this infrastructure Humanities, which is the digital infrastructure in France, is doing a great job in linking metadata of different languages. So they indexes different contents, scholarly contents in different languages, and then they put together metadata, and they try to align them to authorities like the Library of Congress, and then la Bibliothèque Nationale de France, and the National Library of Spain. And so they have 3 or 4 languages for metadata. So you are able to have the keywords of I don't know, a French paper in English, or the keyword of a Spanish paper in French. And so you're able to guess what is about, and the idea is you can ask for translations if you think that some contents are pertinent for you. So, and I think it's another way. I think languages are really, really important for that matters, and that we should work together as a multi-language community. And on the contrary, we are kind of pushed to publish in English and to speak in English, because we know that there is more impact if I publish in English than if I publish in Italian or in French. And I think an infrastructure like that could really do something in that direction.
Right. I completely agree, and I'm open to any kinds of collaborations in like those. I can say that how this all started was that when because I started the North American Victorian Studies Association, I was its president for the first 11 years. And one of the things that I did when I was president is I was approached by ProQuest, and they offered free access to all of their databases for 1 month to our members. And I was really struck after that by how many emails of gratitude I received from scholars, both gratitude and just frustration. And a lot of that from European scholars. So European universities, even more so than the United States, cannot afford access to these sorts of databases. So I'd get emails from Italians and French scholars and German scholars who said, I took as little sleep as I could for 1 month so I could just drill into as much possible data as I could, until the subscription ended. And that's what led to the effort with Mellon to sort of think about, well, is there a way in which we could, as scholars and scholarly societies, work together to gain access to databases in a more permanent way? And that led to this virtual university idea. So, I've tried to work with the commercial providers. I thought that was a good faith effort to figure out a way for them to stay true to their word, because they'll say that they are interested in scholarly endeavor, but their unwillingness to pursue this, I think, speaks otherwise.
Maybe, and I wonder whether you've talked to Matt Gold, with Manifold out of, sort of Uni and their own sort of funding model, because I'm just thinking, and we talked about Manifold with Marcello and his team, about they're offering some of that extra money, like, it's free to use and you can download it, and Marcello has it on his server, or should have it like any day now. Okay, and but then, you can also pay for them to install it, or for them to do so they got a range where clearly it's a bit of a cost recovery aspect, because they're also working with much like Performant, a different crowd, but similar in the idea of people who understand humanities and are not in for the money, but have a cost recovery component.
Yeah.
So they're trying to, and as you know, they just got funded for, like an extra 2 years to try to still to very much explore that. But I was wondering to what extent, without going down the route of, sort of the monk, kind of let's get everybody together and keep on using the same thing. Some of these experiment in trying to find new ways to address, in that case specifically, the crisis of the, monograph, obviously manifold being, let's do, a good and cheap, but, electronic version of monograph, aspect. Have you had a chance to talk to Matt?
Just occasional emails, but nothing in anything extensive. But I applaud any such efforts. In the past we have been very reticent to think about what's sometimes called entrepreneurship, right? As you say, alternative ways of thinking about cost recovery. And again, I'd say that the one exception to the rule about how little one can trust institutions to support databases have been romantic circles, and the decision this year for University of Maryland to just stop supporting that.
Yeah, maybe for the record, I mean, it's moved to Colorado.
It's moved to Colorado under Youngquist.
Youngquist, and they got money there to sign up. So in some ways, it's more the case that this is Neil getting to the end of his career, not so much demise when you said earlier on when they die, but you go to the steps of somebody retiring that has been the lead person. That's an issue. I guess I agree with the same thing if they die. And so that's a good case in point. But in that sense, romantic circle is supposed to go on for another 20 years.
And that's great.
From that perspective. But it was not clear that there would be somebody, stepping up to providing, the guaranteed long-term, the way that Neil had negotiated with Maryland.
Right.
About that. And in some ways, my understanding of the negotiation is that the existence of the site and the long-term preservation within the library was going to continue even if he retired. There was more that there would be no more money for doing new stuff.
Right.
So they had work on the long-term preservation issues, which is another thing that he at Jeffrey Rockwell 20 years ago already was working on DH project that when they came to the end of their life was just like, where do we put it? Because nobody wants to update it. So it wasn't a question of we need money to update it. It was just like, this was a partnership grant out of McMaster, 7 years. We got the money, we got the things, but what do we do with that? So they had worked with the McMaster, library to already be able to ingest it in a way that was, unusual for a project that's more like I do a WordPress site, and at some point I stopped paying the fees, and WordPress is currently free for life, which will stop at some point.
Yeah, it may be unfair for me to pinpoint that one particular project, but it's certainly true that and there have been so many instances of this that you can't trust any one institution because situations change, state funding. Appropriations change, the amount of money that individual departments have or college deans have change year by year, and deans and presidents and heads of department change. And so we can't be sure that even a well-regarded and well-established project can continue given that uncertainty. So that's one reason I'm thinking that scholarly societies could do more along this line, right? Presumably they will continue. And that's one reason why I was keen to set up a constitutional setup whereby there's clear lines of succession. So, if I step down or pass away, one is assured that there will always be somebody at the helm to continue the endeavor.
We can continue the constitution of drinks, but in Canada, there's obviously a couple of caveats in that scholarly associations are very concerned about their very existence at present.
Yeah, in part because you've relied so much on federal funding.
And also funding from journals that have their own pressure to move to an open access, venue, which means that the journal will survive, at least, I'm in favor of shirts policy there, but it's more the fact that the revenue will not go in the pocket of the association the way it used to, which was used to fund other things, not a for-profit thing. But that will have an impact of, why would I renew that? So between numbers dwindling of grad students and faculty in the humanities, and then what used to be before, or at the minimum, going to get the journal, that's one thing. Then the other aspect is the off-print of the very idea, and I know we've talked about that before with Suzanne as well, is some of the tool development made in Canada becomes much more complicated when there is the potential for even a not-for-profit, but a money-generating aspect. And so some of the granting agencies here make it quite complicated to use CFI money to, for instance, contribute to CoreCoab, which even if in a not-for-profit environment, still generates, kind of revenue and all that kind of aspect. So sometimes it's not the case for everything, but for some of them, you basically will not be allowed to use that tool development money for that. Which is a bit, tricky.
And there are other problems too. For example, scholarly societies, most of them are set up so that once a year, however number of people, 200 to 500 to over 1,000, make a huge carbon footprint in having to fly out to an event somewhere around the world. And that's a huge impact on the environment. And one that universities increasingly will want to discourage. A number of Canadian universities like Carleton already do discourage that kind of work. So that's a problem in how organizations are established. It's one of the things I'm interested in having NAFSA move away from. The CoreCoab and these kinds of projects offers another reason for existence also for the scholarly societies, right? That there's a value in our coming together as a scholarly society beyond the carbon footprint of getting on a plane and actually coming to an annual conference.
Although then I'll be the devil's advocate, and people will say that the servers used to, do CoreCoab and access CoreCoab will arguably generate more than people getting together in Colombia.
What do you mean by generate? For the carbon footprint? These are all based on the Pantheon, the Heroku, the servers that we're doing are all working towards
zero sustainability.
Zero system, yeah. So they're the goal, the long-term goal for all of the platform, all of the what's the word I'm looking for? Not the infrastructure, the digital infrastructure behind it is working. All of the ones that we're using are working towards a zero carbon footprint.
No, I guess it's
so. Yeah, I've thought about that too. Yeah,
the Amazon, cloud-based, farms and Apple and other such things are, pretty hot places. Any final comments, questions?
Just the last one about like very much this idea of creating spaces, actual spaces, and this is something on which we are working with Nicolas, Ervan, and others. We on this idea of publishing the sphere, which means exactly what you were saying. We need for actual space where to meet as scholarly societies, for instance. But this actual space can be some publishing platforms. The early journals in the 17th century were like this, spaces where we could keep discussing things like in a room, but in a publishing sphere. And so I like very much this idea of scholarly societies can invest new spaces which are do not ask for take a plane and go somewhere. So I think it's a really interesting way of conceiving what publication should be today. So it's not just sharing texts, it's also building communities, not in the Facebook sense.
So, thank you. Thank you.